I am not amused. Ladies, gentlemen, and druids of all ages, patch 1.1 hit today for Diablo 4, the big pre-patch to the season itself, and it is an absolutely massive patch full of changes, which is what we asked for. And, well, if you're someone who either plays a lot of druid currently, or was planning on playing a druid in Season 1, or even just on the Eternal Realm, we do have a lot to talk about, and let's be straight up, while we avoided major offensive nerfs, our strongest builds still pack a lot of killing power. Not only were our defensive abilities nerfed by a fair amount, but the changes to the way that affixes spawn on gear has really hurt us, especially as a fair amount of our best builds focused on multipliers boosting the additive bonuses that we got from the gear affixes, and so, well, Druid got absolutely reamed in this patch. I will say that, on the whole, Druid did fare better than most of the other classes, really, all things considered, and that is at least a strong point that we have for us, and I realize that that is in fact a consolation prize. So while we were pretty damn strong before, we are still comparatively pretty damn strong now, compared to the other classes. In a world where our worst nerfs are the ones that affect all of the classes, that means that while we will still feel weaker, we sort of made off better than most. We did get some buffs to off-meta playstyles that could lead to new builds being pretty strong, which is a little bit nice. It gets a bit of excitement from me, but the nerfs still definitely hurt, and there were a ton of nerfs to everyone in the patch, but we're going to focus on what affects Druid in particular today. So let's dive into every change in patch 1.1 that affects Druid specifically, what I think it will do to the class as a whole, the various generally played and enjoyed builds, and how it is likely to frame our upcoming experience in Season 1 for anyone who's played Druid before, or who's going to start playing Druid now in the season. First up though, let's start with the cool stuff, which is the announcement of all the new uniques and legendaries. There is an uber unique staff being added to the game. It being uber unique means your chances of seeing it ever in your lifetime are essentially the same as winning the lottery twice, so don't count on it. But if it does happen to drop for you, it is not only usable by Druid, but it is actually a really neat effect that it has that is likely worth using if the actual affixes on the weapon itself are any decent. Gain a random shrine effect for 10 to 20 seconds after killing an elite. That's cool. It can only occur once every 30 seconds. Shrines are strong. Most of the effects that they have are really good, and this effect actually is quite fun. It obviously has no effect in some situations, but when it does work, it means that you're more than likely to get some pretty strong effects going off, and I do really like the look of this. Whether we'll ever use it or not depends on if we ever have it drop at any point soon, but I definitely think it's in the lower tier of uber uniques really as far as power level goes, unless it has a nutty affix on the weapon itself. Then we have our class specific unique, Flesh Render. This is a one-handed mace, which is an okay slot to have. Debilitating Roar and Blood Howl deal 0.5 to 1 damage to nearby poisoned enemies. This is actually a pretty cool effect. Honestly, that damage number scales with item power as well, and for example at item power 820, that effect scales to around 2200 damage on a low roll, 4400 damage on a high roll. That item could very well create its own build really, as a poison build with both Debilitating Roar and Blood Howl would make those pops happen really often, and it depends how much we can stack the damage of that upwards with our other abilities. If those pops of damage can crit as well, things like that, but it seems interesting for sure. It's definitely one to keep an eye on. Then for the general legendary aspects, Audacity isn't really anything special specifically for Druid. We don't really gain much from stunning enemies other than just, having them stunned. No special bonuses within the class itself around that. But then for Craven, that's definitely not bad for any means. 20 to 40% movement speed when moving away from slowed or chilled enemies. Most Druid builds apply poison, and that poison will also slow enemies because of our passive, so you'd have this effect active in pretty much any build that uses the Envenom passive purposefully, which is a lot of currently strong ones. Its main competition is the Ghost Walker aspect that boosts movement speed and lets you walk through enemies while unstoppable, and while that did have incredible synergy with our top builds before, you'll see when we get to it in a bit that Ghost Walker has actually been pretty hard as far as its synergy with Druid as a class. As for our new specific class legendary, we have the Subterranean aspect. Poison Creepers active also cast Landslide in a circle around you. Earth skills deal 10 to 20% bonus damage to poisoned enemies. This one is actually really exciting to me. This has a lot of potential, especially when tied with the Pack Leader boon to reset cooldowns on companion skills. And also, of course, the general concept of Trample Slide builds, which already built around Landslide and Poison Creeper oftentimes anyways. This could make a really strong version of that build come closer to the proper meta, and I'm definitely excited to mess around with that, at least personally. Moving on from that happy new stuff section then, we have the bug fixes specific to Druid. The main things of note here that will affect more common instances of gameplay are a fix to tornadoes utilizing the Storm Chaser aspect to seek enemies they would sometimes before just not deal damage, which is an offensive buff to tornado builds has been fixed now, which is interesting to see for sure, as Tornado Werewolf is the strongest druid build before the patch. They fixed Ravens to have their passive damage from skill upgrades actually apply, which is nice. And they fixed the weird interaction with the Stormclaw aspect that was causing players to occasionally just hit for multiple billions of damage if they built up enough Rampaging Werebeast crit stacking, and that is confirmed to have been a bug due to this, of course. A small thing in the general fixes as well, they fixed an issue where cold enchanted elites would freeze players more often than intended. We'll have to see exactly how much this is reduced, because this is genuinely a big deal, not just for Druid, for everyone, but you'll see soon why I brought this up specifically. Getting frozen was by far the most common and difficult to avoid form of hard CC, and getting hard crowd controlled often just leads to death, so if they've reduced the frequency of this enough, that is nice at the very least. There is also one little general gameplay update that I want to make note of, which says that they generally reduce the tendency for many monsters to move around in combat. This should make life easier for things like tornado builds or for trample slide builds, setting up a good landslide, and for pulverized builds too, getting a nice pile of enemies beside each other. It's just a small bonus to the way that monster AI works. With that, we can now move on to the proper class balance changes and dive into the meat of what is changing for the Druid. First up, we have another buff to the Claw basic skill, specifically its enhancement, raising its attack speed bonus from 10% to 15%, which is actually pretty good. This definitely benefits any werewolf build using Claw, but also any Great Staff of the Crone builds, as that's just 5% bonus attack speed to those builds, which rely heavily on attack speed to reach their goals. They've reduced the base damage reduction of Storm Strike from 25% to 15%, and this is a pretty big hit to the tankiness of any build that uses Storm Strike, but it's not the end of the world at least. It still has a damage reduction effect, which is more than any other basic skill for Druid has, and it still has kept its insane vulnerable proc rate still, which is the big thing that makes Storm Strike actually strong. They've increased the damage of Boulder from 33% weapon damage up to 46%, which is actually a pretty sizable buff. This could potentially make the Boulder builds actually work. I had a Boulder build that I was messing around with pre-patch that I just found to be way too offensively weak, but it might actually have a place now in the season, as that is a pretty notable damage buff to that skill that's the core of that build, and I'm excited to see if that does actually work out. Savage Trample has had its spirit that it gives you doubled from 20 to 40. This makes it better for specifically that purpose, of course. Mostly this is good for pulverized builds that struggle with resource generation but use trample in general anyways. Prime Lacerate healing increased from 3% to 5% is just whatever, honestly. Lacerate isn't unused because it doesn't provide enough healing. That's just a misunderstanding of the issue with Lacerate, honestly. It will still not see a whole lot of use even with that change. Then we have a couple of pretty strong changes to Cataclysm that could easily bring a lightning build more into the forefront of Druid gameplay, and that does make me quite excited to see, honestly. As of right now, I'm seeing an improved landslide trample slide build having good legs, an improved boulder build as well, and an improved lightning build, and that by itself is exciting to have. More variety of decent builds, even if they won't quite be top tier. That said, now is where we get to an absolutely massive nerf to a lot of current Druid builds. Prime Grizzly Rage now grants Unstoppable for 6 seconds instead of just while active. This means that instead of having the Unstoppable buff for the full duration of Grizzly Rage, which was upwards of 20 seconds, we now only have it for 6 seconds, which is just such a massive nerf to the survivability and tankiness of any build that uses Grizzly Rage, which is a lot of the builds. It means that we are far more susceptible to crowd control, and it means that we have to play way more carefully, which as a result will likely lower damage output of all of these builds. Past that, the Provocation passive was buffed, having its time required staying in bear form reduced to 16 seconds at 3 ranks before you get a guaranteed overpower, which is nice, honestly, but it's not massive. Hilariously, this actually changes it back to how it was before they nerfed this at launch, back to how it functioned in the beta. Who knew? It's not terrible, it's not build defining, it's just sort of there. Then we have changes to Spirit Boons, which includes another massive nerf to Druid survivability. Masochistic is now a 75% lucky hit chance to trigger, which means when you get a crit with a shapeshifting skill, you have a 75% lucky hit chance to heal 3% of your maximum life. Before the patch, you would just heal any time that you hit with a shapeshifting skill and it was a crit. This is just a massive reduction to our healing in the top tier endgame builds, and it's something that we're honestly just gonna have to learn to live with. It does suck though, it really is not nice. This was a big hit. The thorns from Prickle Skin were increased from 0.1 to 0.15. Not a bad increase, but Druid isn't really capable of a proper thorns focused build, so that is honestly irrelevant. I don't know why they're even focused focusing on this right now. Iron Feather max life increase bumped up from 10% bonus to 14%. Again, it's not bad, but it doesn't make this better than the other Eagle Path boons, so it still likely won't see a whole lot of use. Bolster Fortify was increased from 10% to 15% max life as Fortify when you use a defensive skill. This boon was already used occasionally, so that's actually a buff that affects us, but most of the builds that it affects were also nerfed, so it's more of a compensation than an actual buff, honestly. And I wouldn't say that it's enough of one, really, either. Still nice to have a relevant buff of some sort here though, I suppose. Then Overload damage increased from 0.2 to 0.25, still hard to justify it in the snake path, but with the big nerf to Masochistic, we might see more variety in spirit boons as a result, which could make this actually matter for lightning builds, of course. For our Paragon glyphs, the spirit glyph now applies bonus critical damage to all damage, not just core skills, which is nice as far as opening up more potential playstyles utilizing this glyph. And then we have balancing changes to various legendary aspects. The aspect of Calm Breeze, lucky hit chance for wind shear to fill your spirit gauge, was increased from 5 to 10% up to 7 to 12%, which isn't bad, but this isn't really used, and I doubt this will change that much. The balanced aspect boost to maximum spirit when in Grizzly Rage increased from 30 to 50 up to 60 to 80. That's actually pretty nice. I could see that taking a ring slot position in earlier pulverized builds, maybe, but likely not much of an effect on the actual endgame. Aspect of the Tempest damage bonus to Hurricane per second active increased from 7 to 15% up to 10 to 18%. Not bad. It won't change much either, really, honestly. This aspect is pretty unused, and there's a decent reason for that. Skinwalker aspect healing when you shapeshift increased from 0.05 to 1 up to 0.07 to 0.12. Very slight buff to a mostly irrelevant aspect. Honestly, I don't really see the point, to be real with you. And then the other big nerf to the strong druid builds, symbiotic aspect cooldown reduction changed from 4 to 8 seconds on an Nature's Fury proc down to 3 to 5 seconds. This really hurt symbiotic builds. They did buff the attack speed of Claw a little bit, which helps with the Crone versions of these, but it doesn't make up for how much of a nerf this is. And that's honestly just really frustrating to me. The only proper meta symbiotic build was Earthen Bulwark, and the reason that that build was meta was a bugged interaction with Earthen Bulwark in high tier nightmare dungeons. So instead of fixing the Earthen Bulwark bug, they instead nerfed the symbiotic aspect, which also kicks Trample Slide, as an example, in the face, and that's just not cool. Honestly, I really dislike this decision. I know that they know what the problem with the Earthen Bulwark build was, but the problem with that combo, and instead of fixing what the actual issue was, they instead nerfed the part of the combo that also affects multiple other builds, and that's just such an awkward way to handle it all. I don't like that. Then we have a couple of buffs to companion-based aspects, the Stampede aspect getting its damage bonus increased from 10 to 20% up to 16 to 26%, which is actually pretty decent, and the Shepherd's damage bonus increased from 6 to 8% up to 6 to 10%, just upping the high end of that a little bit. I do think that companion builds actually have a fair bit of potential within Season 1 with some of the changes that they've made here, especially one of the Malignant Hearts that they added, which we will be talking about later. And while I do like that companion builds are being made a bit more relevant, I don't think that they'll ever reach proper top tier viability unless you up the survivability of wolves, which they simply did not do in this patch. Past that, we have two changes to uniques, both incredibly related: the skill ranks to Werebear skills from Insatiable Fury and the skill ranks to Werewolf skills from Mad Wolf's Glee were both increased by 1. Now the tooltip in game on the item says that it increases those skills by 3 ranks, but fully upgraded it actually increases them by 4, so this is a notable buff to these items, and this boosts our offensive ability in endgame with these uniques. But again, our biggest nerfs were defensive, absolutely, and this sadly doesn't really fix that. Aside from that, we just have the general nerfs that everyone suffered to affix potency, but we got hit a tiny little bit extra in the form of total armor in Werebear form and total armor in Werewolf form having their rolls reduced by 25%, which is just a bit sad. However, the general total armor percentage affix was reduced by 30%, which means technically we did come out just a little bit ahead. It just sucks to have our armor reduced by such a massive amount in general anyways. This is generally going to cause some issues with a lot of builds. I have no idea how completable a tier 100 nightmare dungeon even is at this moment as a result of this for Druid, but it feels like they just wanted to nerf everyone a ton, and well, they definitely did. At least on the class specific side of things though, Druid got off mostly scot-free, aside from the symbiotic aspect nerf and the unstoppable nerf on Grizzly Rage as our two main drops in power. That said, we should talk for a moment about the Malignant Hearts. This won't help at all for people that are only playing on the Eternal Realm, and I'm sorry that that is the case, but for those who are wanting to play Druid in Season 1, we have the full list of Malignant Heart powers revealed, and they are actually relatively promising for us. There are ones that deal lightning damage that could potentially fit into into lightning builds, ones that give you the ability to occasionally spend life instead of resource for a core skill. This one could definitely have a spot in a pulverized build, for example, and I have a lot of interest in seeing how the Barber Malignant Heart works too in actual effective gameplay. It is very strange. It does have the potential to slow down your kill time, but in combination with Grizzly Rage, this could actually do some really interesting things for a lot of Druid builds if you play it right, especially with Earthen Might as well. We also have the Druid-specific hearts. Moon Rage is massive for companion builds, especially as it just adds to your active companion count when it procs, which affects our companion legendaries as well. And I think that that could make some fun stuff happen outside of super high tier content where I still think companions might not be strong enough. Agitated Winds is pretty useless, honestly. Inexorable Force, though, is awesome. It gives Druid its first pull effect in the game, as we simply do not have one of those in any other part of our kit. We have a bunch of knockbacks, we have some knockdowns, but we don't have any pulls until this Malignant Heart, and honestly, I hope that when the season ends, they find a way to add this as a legendary aspect, because having a pull is just such a big deal. Unconstrained Beast, depending on how it functions, could be good, it could be bad, but it could just help out with the fact that we lost a ton of our unstoppable time on Grizzly Rage. What I am hoping is that this gives you just a 3-second bonus Grizzly Rage window whenever it procs that reactivates the unstoppable buff, but my main worry is that it could reset the crit damage stacking from Rampaging Werebeast, which would really suck. So hopefully it doesn't do that, because if not, this could make up for a lot of the survivability nerf that we got hit with in the patch notes, but we'll only be able to see it in World Tier 4, and again, it doesn't even affect people on the Eternal Realm, which just, it really sucks for them. Honestly, I feel really bad for people that are on the Eternal Realm after this patch, because the only things that counteract the nerfs that we got are the Malignant Hearts, which are a part of the season only. Oh, and by the way, there were actually a couple of hidden changes that weren't even part of the patch notes for Druid that are actually really important to be aware of. In the tooltip for Envenom on the skill page, the skill tree, if you actually look at it, it now has a plus next to it. This used to have an X next to it because it was a multiplier. It is a multiplier to your crit damage, and the difference between having a multiplier to crit damage and just an additive to crit damage is actually really massive, so the fact that this was changed is a big deal, but it's just a tooltip. In actual effect in the game, this is still a multiplier. It just has a plus in the tooltip now, which seems to be just some sort of bug that they had with the patch, so it's whatever. Don't worry about this. I know you've looked at this. I know you've been concerned. It's not actually in effect. This is still a multiplier. Past that, though, the Avian Wrath Spirit boon, which was labeled as a multiplier since release, but actually in effect was only additive, is now a multiplier. They've actually fixed this so that it does what it is intended to do, which makes this a significantly better spirit boon and actually makes it top tier for a lot of builds. As a result, this is actually wound up being a slight buff for Druid, even though the visual changes within the game imply that there might have been a nerf, so, you know, take that with whatever grain of salt that you feel like taking it. And that just about does it. Everything specifically relevant to Druid in patch 1.1, and how much it matters, how big of an effect that it has, and also just my thoughts on where Druid stands now after the patch. Honestly, I think we're still pretty strong. We were hit hard, but not as hard as many other classes, and so we are still in a pretty okay position, all things considered. Of course, I'd rather be sitting here happy about all the buffs to the off-meta playstyles that we got, but it's hard to do that when every single player in Diablo 4 was nerfed a noticeable amount today. It just makes the game feel less good to actually play, going from strong to less strong so suddenly and so heavily, but hopefully we'll at least get some fun out of Season 1, right? Hopefully the new normal will start to feel good once again once we get used to it, because I do still enjoy this game. I still want to play it. I still have a good time when I do. It's just hard not to get demoralized when the devs hit us with this, you know? Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.